Hi, it's Michelle with the Sleep Coach School. I'm back with another open class 129. But before I jump right in, just a reminder to everyone that if you're looking for any extra coaching support, please head over to the sleepcoachschool.com where we have several different coaching options to provide support if you need it. So, with that, we have three great questions today. So, let's jump right in. Let's get started. Our first question is from James. I've really struggled with hypnic jerks this year. They seem to go away for a few months, but I've hit a speed bump and they've returned. And now, in addition to having them as I'm falling asleep, if I do manage to get to sleep, I will have full body jolts, which will wake me up after only an hour or so. It's very disruptive, like being a startled awake after a bad dream. On a given night, this will happen multiple times. I try to accept it and not struggle against it, but it's hard. At best, I'm just stringing together a small handful of shallow hours of sleep. Before, even if I had some hypnic jerks initially, I used to be able to count on staying asleep once I fell asleep. Now, even if I get to sleep, I am yanked out of it. Since this jolt occurs in the middle of sleep as opposed to right as I'm falling asleep, is this still a hypnic jerk or something else? Is this also just caused by hyperarousal and anxiety? Thanks. Great question. So, James, yes, basically, this is absolutely hyperarousal. And even though it's happening in the middle of the night, it's still a hypnic jerk. So it doesn't matter where it happens, whether at sleep onset or later in the night, it's still a hypnic jerk, that jolting feeling. And absolutely, yes, this is still being caused by hyperarousal. And a lot of the times hyperarousal can show up in different ways, and it can almost try to convince us that something really new or really different or dangerous is happening because suddenly it's showing up really differently, when really it's the same hyperarousal just showing up with a new pattern and just convincing us that, well, maybe this is something really different when it's not. So yes, this is the same old hyperarousal kind of playing new tricks, so to speak. And I completely understand how you feel. I was also having a lot of hypnic jerks and a lot of twitching during my insomnia, and it was a huge challenge. And similar to what you describe, I also had a lot of this start just at sleep onset. And I could also count on for a period of time, well, once I'm asleep, they won't really bother me or wake me up too much. And then I had several times during my insomnia where this shifted completely. And just like you're describing, they would start waking me up and jolting me up at night. And I found this very confusing. It was very frustrating because just like you're describing, it absolutely can segment your sleep and just create so much confusion. But just know that this is just the same hyperarousal. These are the same hypnic jerks that you were experiencing before, and they're just showing up in the middle of the night, unfortunately. But it's the same exact thing. And so maybe your hyperarousal is a little bit higher, maybe it's a little bit elevated, but really it is your brain's way of showing up and trying to protect you, even though it feels very misguided. So a lot of the times, these hypnic jerks and things like jerks and twitches can really happen because our hyperarousal levels can get really high from being really afraid that we're not going to sleep, or even being really afraid that we're going to experience something like a hypnic jerk. And, our brain can start to become so incredibly fearful, not just around sleep, but around our hyperarousal symptoms or around nighttime in and of itself. And, it essentially starts to feel like nighttime is really going into battle with all of these things. And if it thinks that you're going into battle at night, it thinks that you need to be awake for that. And so it's essentially waking you up because nighttime is this really, stressful time where all this stressful stuff happens. So my gosh, I better wake him up and make sure that he's awake to deal with this stressful stuff. So unfortunately, our brains have that type of primitive understanding of what's going on, and for us, it's really confusing. And so, quite literally, these hypnic jerks waking you up in the middle of the night, could be your brain trying to say, well, wait, we shouldn't be sleeping. This is the time where we feel stressed, or this is the time where something bad happens and we need to be awake for it. And they can also happen from a lot of self monitoring, which again increases our hyperarousal. And when we're really stuck in insomnia, like, most of us have been, we start to self monitor ourselves a lot. It becomes, almost impossible not to. And this creates more hypervigilance and more hyperarousal, unfortunately. And so sometimes even that alone, kind of really, really monitoring ourselves and our symptoms like jerks, can create more of those very symptoms as the brain thinks, oh, I'm going to really be monitoring and letting him know when this is going to happen. And then it will jerk and kind of wake you up. So all that to say, these are different manifestations of the same hyperarousal, just playing some new tricks. And what really comes into play here, since we can't directly, we can't control whether or not we have twitches or hypnic jerks, but we can have some control over how we start to mentally and emotionally respond to these jerks happening. And I know from my own experience that I spent a long time responding to jerks and twitches with panic, with fear. And, a big part of that came because I didn't know where they were coming from and why they were happening. But as I would respond to them with more panic, this would increase my hyperarousal and lead to more twitching and to more hypnic jerks. And so what I found was that, as difficult as it is, and I know how difficult it is truly, but if you're able to start observing and actually responding to these hypnic jerks in a way that sends a safety message to your brain, because your brain is afraid, that can help over time reduce the hyperarousal that you're experiencing. And as the hyperarousal goes down, you'll experience fewer and fewer jerks. So see if you can, as unpleasant as they are, be with them, observe them, and respond to them in a way that is reinforcing safety. And sometimes that might just be, oh, okay, I noticed that happen. I'm awake. It's okay. I'm safe. It's all right. And just kind of reinforcing that safety. So I hope that helps. I certainly know how frustrating these types of experiences can be, but just know that it is hyperarousal and that this is something that you can change over time. Oh, okay, our next question is from Jack. He says, hi, Daniel. I'm feeling hyperaroused for quite a long time now. I wake up at night when I'm not able to sleep and I try reading a book or watching a movie to chill, but as soon as I go back to bed, I am hyper aroused again. This fear is so bizarre that I have started feeling afraid of sleep. The method of befriending wakefulness is not working. I know it takes time, but as more and more days are passing by, I am getting more tired and my eyes are full of battle scars, though there was no battle. Can you suggest something so that I can sleep well? I don't know about CBT-I if that is needed to cure me. I know it has something to do with my brain, but what exactly it is something I'm not able to figure out. This is another great question. So in this scenario, I mean, I completely understand how, the fear of not sleeping could even shift to now becoming afraid of sleeping and afraid of being in the bed if every time you're returning to the bed, you're having this hyperarousal suddenly increase again, and how frustrating that would be. And this is so incredibly common, so much so that, we have a term for it, and it's called the Houdini effect. When you can leave the bed, do something that you really enjoy, and the moment you go back into bed, all of a sudden, all of the hyperarousal, all of the stress, the fear, the anxiety, it all comes rushing back out of thin air. out of nowhere. And we wonder, well, what the heck? I was over here watching a movie, feeling great. I was calm. Why is it the moment I come back into bed, it's all here again? And I know how frustrating this is. This is something I also dealt with for years myself. I would leave the bed, just like you're saying, I would read, I would watch a movie, and the moment I would come back into bed, all of my fear, all of my anxiety, it was like it was waiting for me in my bed. And it was incredibly frustrating. And we talk a lot here about, the importance of befriending wakefulness. But it's also important to know that there's not just one way to befriend wakefulness. And you really do have to play around and find what works for you. And so I'll share a little bit about my experience because I relate to this so much. I've had this experience so many times. And for me, because I was finding that every time I was going back into bed, that it was all waiting for me, um, I decided that I was actually going to take the approach of staying in bed. And part of this is because, our fear, our anxiety, all the things that come up, they are signals from our brain. Our brain is trying to communicate with us. And sometimes what really helps is listening to the signal. And oftentimes that helps kind of decrease the signal, if not right away, over time. And so, what really helped for me when I was having this experience was I would choose to stay in bed and I would choose to work on accepting and observing what was happening. So for me, that looked like a lot of twitching, it looked like a racing heart rate, it looked like night sweats, things like that. There were a lot of different hyperarousal symptoms showing up. And I would practice being there with all of it and seeing if I could drop into that observer role with myself to really observe everything that was happening without judgment, noticing if I was having a fear response to what was happening, and practicing observing without any judgment and reminding myself that I was safe while I was having these experiences. And, over time, after I worked on that and I was able to kind of be with it and accept it and observe it, I started working on welcoming the unwelcome, which is really a practice where you start to welcome in all of these different hyperarousal symptoms intentionally. And the reason why that can be really helpful and why it was so helpful for me is because when we welcome something in, we're sending a signal of safety to our brains. So, for example, before, if I would start twitching, my response would be one of fear. I would tense up, I would start to panic, and all the thoughts I would be having would be fear based. And when I started to step away from that and realize that my responses to what was happening could either create more of that symptom or it could decrease the symptom, that's where the welcoming piece really was helpful for me. So I would start to welcome them in. And every time I would welcome these symptoms in, such as anxiety or fearful thoughts or twitches, I would notice that they would start to subside, often in real time. And so sometimes that can even look like talking to the symptom. I would say, like, oh, twitching, okay, there you are again. Welcome in, welcome, you're welcome here. Um, I'm going to spend some time with you tonight. That's okay. I'm completely safe right now. And so for me, that really helped because my brain was sending me a lot of signals, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of physical symptoms. And for me, I needed to start really listening to them in the moment and to be with them, to observe them, and to welcome them in. And that was helping send my brain cues of safety so that hyperarousal could go down. So that was my way of befriending wakefulness at that time, since leaving the bed, especially in the beginning, really didn't work well for me because just like you're describing, it was all waiting for me when I returned. But there's several ways to befriend wakefulness. So there's of course the approach that I just outlined, But there's other things you can try doing as well. You can actually stay in bed and do something that you really enjoy, and see if that's more helpful. Because sometimes we can start to associate our bed with so much stress and anxiety, and so it can be nice to actually bring in things that we enjoy and actually do it in bed so we can start to feel just more comfortable in our own bed again. 'Cause sometimes we can lose that. So that's another suggestion I would have for you is, can you watch the movie in bed without leaving? How does that feel? You know, bring whatever activity you are going to do, bring it into bed with you and see if it helps create a space that feels a little bit less stressful. And this is also something you can do in the daytime as well, is doing activities like watching a funny movie or reading a book you enjoy, but doing it in bed so that some of that stress association with the bed kind of starts to go down a little bit. So those are just a few options for you to think about, and just know there are multiple ways that you can work on befriending wakefulness. And it's all about trying out a couple of different things just to see what works best for you. Okay, so I hope that helps. Let's move on to our next question. Our next question is from Jennifer, and she says, the content offered through your channel and website and various guests and coaches, as well as viewers, is a wonderful resource. Thank you for offering something positive for those of us that struggle. I've been a follower for several months. This summer marked 1 year since my insomnia began, and unfortunately, I haven't made much progress. To complicate matters, I was diagnosed 2 months ago with a chronic illness that seems to worsen at night and make simply getting comfortable very, very difficult. It is definitely feeding my insomnia. My question is there anything different that should be done if we are also facing a chronic illness, or do the same insights still apply as we work through our insomnia? The past 2 months, especially the past 2 weeks, have been my worst yet, and I am beyond exhausted. Thank you. Jennifer, I'm certainly sorry to hear that you've been struggling lately and that you are feeling as exhausted as you're feeling. I know that's incredibly hard. And this question, it really touched me because I relate to this a lot. I myself have a chronic illness as well. And, you know, it's very difficult because when you are dealing with a chronic condition, especially one that makes it difficult to, get comfortable in bed, or involves, a chronic pain element that makes it difficult to get comfortable, to stay comfortable, or to stay asleep. It can be very, very hard to, be dealing with that issue and then also be coping with insomnia. And I went through this as well. So I know how difficult this feels. And first and foremost, the same approach does apply. And so, yes, the same approach applies, and having chronic illness issues does not change the approach that you can take for your insomnia. And so, I think one really important thing when you have chronic illness and you have chronic insomnia is to actually separate them, because these two things are actually two different things, but they can so easily become one thing with, the chronic illness kind of, as you mentioned, almost feeding the insomnia. And before you know it, it's, the chronic illness is the cause of the insomnia or vice versa. And I know that I did that a little bit with myself as well. And it's very, very common because you can very easily start to think of your chronic illness as really the main cause of the ongoing insomnia, especially if there's chronic pain involved. It's very, very common. And what I wanted to share, one of the things I wanted to share is a really helpful quote. And this was a quote from Daniel. It was the very first quote that I saw on this channel, and it had a huge impact on me. And I'm not going to get it completely right, so Daniel, forgive me, but I'm pretty sure he said something like, there are 1,000 things that can cause sleep disturbances, but only how you think about them can cause insomnia. And I just thought, whoa, this is big. That was one of my light bulb moments for me personally, is realizing that only how I think about it can cause insomnia, and that there is this really big difference between sleep disturbance and insomnia. Sleep disturbance is really any disruption to your sleep. So if you're struggling, let's say, with chronic pain issues or any chronic issues that are causing discomfort, can absolutely cause sleep disturbance. Insomnia, on the other hand, is really the fear of not sleeping and all the hyperarousal that manifests as a result of that fear. And so it's very possible to experience sleep disturbance, but actually never experience insomnia. And so I think those concepts are really important, especially when it comes to chronic illness. And I know in my own experience, when I would have an experience with my chronic illness that would keep me up at night, this would accentuate and perpetuate all of the fear that I had around not sleeping. And again, like I said, it all became one. And after I realized that really there's a difference between that sleep disruption and insomnia, and the insomnia is really that mental part of it, that fear, that anxiety, and how our brain gets trained in fear. And, you know, for an example, now, although I still have chronic illness issues, and they can still cause sleep issues. If I'm not feeling well, maybe it will be difficult for me to fall asleep or stay asleep. But the difference is it no longer causes insomnia. And that's because I now see the difference between sleep disruption and insomnia. So I can still experience sleep disruption, but it is a completely different experience than when I was experiencing insomnia. And that's because there's no fear involved, there's no anxiety involved, and there isn't any hyperarousal. There is just the sleep disruption, which of course is not ideal, of course, but there isn't any stress around that sleep disruption. And there isn't any association between the chronic issue I might be dealing with and the creation of insomnia around it. So I hope that helps in terms of providing some feedback in terms of, how chronic illness and sleep interact, and just knowing that, you know, there is that really, really important difference between sleep disruption, which can come into play with when you have a chronic condition, absolutely, and that can be deeply frustrating. But that, it doesn't need to create insomnia, because insomnia is really that mental fear and that hyperarousal. And it can be really helpful to separate the two and just know that absolutely, yes, the same approaches to your insomnia still apply, even if you have a chronic issue as well. So keep, listening to the channel, and hopefully learning and implementing the teachings, and hopefully that helps clear a little bit of that up. Okay, so those were our questions for today. We love getting your questions. So if ever you do want some clarification on any of the teachings, please send in a question. We're always happy to read everything that you send in. And until next time, I'll see you at the next open class.